Today on the podcast, our final installment on anthropology and ethics. We're looking at the differences between the Christian East and the Christian West on the nature of man. That's coming at you today on the Nathan Jacobs Podcast. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Nathan Jacobs Podcast. As always, thank you for tuning in. So we are in our final installment. I can hear the laughter already, but it's true. This is the final installment on our series on anthropology and ethics. What did I say we were going to start with? I think when I first started this, I predicted 3 episodes. That's what I was predicting, yes. And immediately the comments erupted with jokes about I look forward to the 14-part series. I think, the irony is I think somebody cracked like a joke about can't wait for the 7-part series. So is that right? I mean, I think I'd have to check, but I think this might be episode 7. Anyway, we'll have to check in on the poly market, see who won in terms of predicting how many episodes this series would actually be. But I think it's somewhere in that ballpark. But today really will be the last episode. I can hear already. Yeah, right. But no, it's true. We are committed. This is the last one in this series. And so what we've been doing is looking at the connection between anthropology and ethics. And where I began was walking through the history of ideas, looking specifically at the various ways in which worldview begins to affect how the philosophical system sees the human person and his place within the world. And then with that, what I also did is I walked back through the history of ideas after laying that groundwork and showed the ways in which the other ethical systems, the various ethical systems in the field of moral philosophy, end up evolving naturally out of that perspective on the world and man's place within the world. And then finally, last week, what we did is we took a look at some specific hot button ethical issues within our own culture through the lens of several ethical systems that sort of represented the spectrum of positions within the field of moral philosophy. Obviously, it was only a sampling of the ethical systems, but a representative sample nonetheless. And so we saw the ways in which ethical systems diverge in major ways based on whether or not, for example, you believe that the world is ordered by something like a mind, you're a providentialist, and therefore you believe in such a thing as the order of nature in some sort of metaphysically objective sense, and therefore ethics becomes about my place within the world and conforming to the order of nature, or whether, on the other hand, you're an anti-providentialist who doesn't believe that there is an order to nature, and therefore good and bad has more to do with pleasure and pain, and thus it becomes more of a subjective enterprise, where ethics is more about facilitating a generally pleasant existence. And so we saw that major divide and how that divide plays out in the realm of ethics, that really when you're talking about a lot of these disputes and you see that fork in the road that we experience within culture all the time, the real root of that is down at that sort of level 4 of discourse, the way I've called that, right? The idea that we have like meme culture, level 1, we have a lot more words, but really not saying too much more in terms of laying out our position on an ethical issue, which is level 2. And then at level 3, that's where we get into meta-ethics, where we're actually fleshing out what we mean by good and evil, right and wrong, what the basis for that is. And all of those, as we saw, is an extension of level 4 issues, where you're dealing with metaphysics. And now you're talking about sort of fundamental worldview issues, how you see reality itself. And so we saw that divide and how it emerges when you begin to take into account these sort of level 4 and level 3 issues. And yet, the other thing I wanted to highlight is that these various ethical systems, as much as they diverge from one another, they don't quite diverge to what our culture presumes. So it wasn't as if the utilitarian naturally, affirms various social agendas that are present and dominant within our culture. In fact, what we saw was that even utilitarianism actually takes a more moderate position than a lot of the default settings that people have. And this was the other thing that I wanted to highlight, is that within our culture, there seems to be not only default sort of moral intuitions, right? Instincts about what a person ought to think or say or believe, but also there is this sort of presumption that the only reason somebody would ever disagree with the sort of standard secular fundamentalism is that, you are some sort of religious zealot who believes in a book that supposedly is spoken by God that prohibits some of these things. But my point in highlighting these various ethical systems was that even within the more anti-providential systems, you still have reason to question a lot of the positions within our culture. And I think that's really important to see, because what it means is that when you move into actual ethical discourse, when you bother to go down to that level 4 and level 3 issue, when you start to talk at that level, what you see is there's good reason to question the sorts of things that are just taken for granted in our culture. So anyway, that was last time. Now today, what I want to do is I wanted to zero in on specifically the anthropological differences between the Christian East and the Christian West. I touched on these in talking about the history of ideas, and then talking about ethical systems. I just sort of brushed against some of these differences, highlighted them, but I didn't really zero in on them because I had promised that we'd be doing an entire episode just focused on the anthropological divide between the Christian East and the Christian West. Now, why do I want to do that? Well, the reason is this. First of all, I think the question of anthropology, right, the divide between the Christian East and the Christian West on anthropology really does matter. And we'll see that, hopefully as I flesh this out, you'll see the ramifications of these these two anthropological positions. And then the second thing is just acknowledging that a lot of my listeners who come here are interested, yes, in philosophy, but also specifically in my take as an Eastern Orthodox Christian philosopher, which I am, right? I am a philosopher who ultimately became Eastern Orthodox. And so what you see when I delve into these topics, right, whatever they might be, it's reflective partially of my, exploration of the history of ideas, but also of the fact that my exploration of the history of ideas ultimately led me to Eastern Orthodoxy. And so I realize that that is one of the unique elements that draws people here. And so I think it's worth zeroing in on that particular topic because I presume it would be interesting to you, dear listeners. So hopefully I'm correct. So with that, let's dive into this question of anthropology in the Christian East and the Christian West. Now, as I am apt to do, I tend to begin with the anthropology of the Christian West. And the reason is because I recognize that for most listeners, we have been steeped within a Western culture that is born out of Catholicism and Protestantism. And as I've pointed out in other contexts, the underlying presumptions of Catholicism and Protestantism are essentially the same. Like Protestantism grows out of the soil of Catholicism. It is a protest against Rome. And yet those protesters, right, the reformers themselves, were steeped within Roman Catholic theology. They were Roman Catholics who decided to contest certain premises of Roman Catholic theology. But one of the things that I've pointed out in the past is that oftentimes the underlying presumptions of the Protestants having been born out of Catholicism means that a Catholic and a Protestant have more in common worldview-wise than an Eastern Orthodox Christian who doesn't share those presumptions. And so oftentimes the Catholics and the Protestants can nod along with the same underlying presumptions because it is an in-house dispute. As I've talked about in other contexts when talking about grace, or I talk about merits and demerits, I talk about the transference of merits. Whenever I've talked about those sorts of issues, my entire point has been to highlight that it is an in-house discussion, that it grows out of the same soil, but there is a dispute, right? Whose merits? How do we acquire these merits? How are they transferred? Are we ultimately made actually righteous and therefore have our own merits, or are we sort of made right with God by foreign merits, and so on and so forth? It's all a very Catholic discussion, and so I hate to say it, but Protestants, you're just bad Catholics. That's all it is. I tease, of course, but it actually is true, right? Protestants are rebellious Catholics. And so to no surprise, the Protestant world tends to have lenses and presuppositions when they approach theology and the Bible that are inherently reflective of the underlying development of Latin Western thought. And so I always find it useful to begin with that development because it helps bring to light the lenses that are there. And once that's highlighted, then it becomes easier to draw the contrast where it's like, okay, so now that you understand the underlying presuppositions, let's take a look at the contrasting position within the Christian East. And so it is with anthropology. That's how we're going to begin. So, the most definitive discussion in my mind when trying to highlight the underlying anthropology of the Latin West is actually the Pelagian dispute. And the reason is because, for reasons that we'll get to, the Pelagian dispute really sort of set a red line for everybody in the Latin West. And for that reason, the underlying anthropology within that discussion became the line that no one is allowed to cross. And it has major ramifications for how nature and grace, and specifically man as one who is part of nature, is viewed. And so with that, I'm going to trod some, well-trodden territory that you may have heard me talk about before if you've listened to like the Connectly episode or something like that, where I've talked about these sort of Latin presumptions about merits and demerits and things like that. I also talk about this in the penal substitution episode. Within the Pelagian dispute is sparked by, not by Pelagius, actually, by Celestius, who was a pupil of Pelagius. And Celestius was one who advocated a series of premises that really, East and West, everybody would have deemed heretical. But essentially, Celestius was advocating a view of man that all of us are basically autonomous islands, right? Adam's sin only affected Adam. It has no bearing on Christ. Christ's merits and things like that. His own life doesn't affect us. It affects only himself. He's basically a moral model that essentially the law of Moses is just as good of a way of, attaining salvation as the gospel of Christ because it's basically moral mandates and so on. So ultimately, Celestius was essentially sort of a proto-moralist of modernity, right? Where he essentially looked at man as an island where salvation has nothing to do with, anything other than ethics. And that ultimately what the law of Moses and the gospel of Christ are all about is just teaching you to be a good person. What Christ is nothing more than a moral model. And that all of us are basically our own individual islands who are responsible for our own behaviors. We don't affect one another. We're insulated from one another and so on. And clearly, that wasn't going to fly within Christianity, which had a very different understanding of man and our connection both with Adam and with Christ and so on. But the critical feature of the Pelagian dispute, what ultimately began to spill over into a larger dispute within the Latin West, was something that gave rise to this question of, what is the nature of grace and what does it mean to say that a person is saved by grace? Now, here's why that question naturally emerges within the Latin West. So let's first talk about something that I've touched on in past episodes, which is merits and demerits within the Latin West. Within Latin Christian writers, there was frequent talk of merits and demerits. And in fact, when talking about things like predestination, and you could go see my brief history of predestination, the first installment on that at theologicalletters.com, which is my Substack. The first installment of that, I highlight some of these texts so you can see this for yourself. But the idea was basically when asking something about like predestination, right? What does it mean that God predestines somebody to salvation? The early Latin answer was basically that God foreknows who is going to be responsive and who is going to repent and who is going to live a life worthy of God. And basically what this early position argued was that, Paul writes about those he foreknew, he predestined. And so predestination is based on foreknowledge. And what's it foreknowledge of? Well, it's foreknowledge of merits. And so God chooses those who are worthy of being chosen. That was basically the position. Right. And what you find is within the early Augustine then, right, this idea that we repent and we pursue virtue and we acquire merits, and God chooses those who have merits and are worthy of being chosen, was actually the natural default for Augustine himself, Augustine of Hippo. And so it's interesting that when Augustine talks about merits and demerits in his early work, this ends up being tied with a doctrine that I've talked about elsewhere called the order of loves, right? And this is important background to understand. But basically, Augustine, what he recognizes that you and I, whenever we face a choice, that choice is based on different desires, right? Different loves. We see food, we desire it, right? We see sex, we desire it, right? We see family, we desire it. And then hopefully also we see God and we desire him. But the fact of the matter is, that all of these different loves pull us in conflicting directions because we can't have all of those things in total all at once. If, for example, our affection or our desire pulls us toward, ease, and yet also pulls us toward physical activity because it's healthy or good for us, or because we value vanity or whatever it might be, those are in conflict. And ultimately, when you choose something, you have to pick which one you're going to follow. And that means you create a hierarchy of loves within you. And so Augustine presumed that whenever you have a choice and you make a choice, what's happening is you are creating a hierarchy of loves. I value this over this, over this, over this, right? And so when answering the question of what does it look like to be righteous or just, right, Augustine's answer actually had to do with this. Justice, in Latin, justitia, means you render to each its due. So if exercise actually is superior to ease in this case, then the just man would choose exercise over ease. That's what it means to be just. In other words, his affections mirror reality. Whatever the highest good is, that's his highest love. And then on down, reflecting or mirroring reality. And of course, love of God is going to be above all else. And so Augustine, using this notion of the order of loves, ultimately kind of systematized for the Latin West how merits and demerits work, right? What are merits based on? They're based on deeds that are pleasing to God that reflect a proper or just order of loves, whereas demerits have to do with disordered loves. Now, the reason that's important is because within the early Augustine, what you see the position that was there before him, the idea that it is within our power to make choices that are either just or unjust. So the early Augustine asks, well, what happens if I look inside and I realize I have disordered loves, right? My loves are unjust. What do I do? And Augustine's early answer is you will to fix it, right? He put it within the power of the will, the natural will of man, to go ahead and just reorder these loves. And in this sense, produce just deeds, which would have merit before God, which ultimately means they would be salvific. Because part of the problem was that Pelagius was appealing to Augustine. He was just saying, like, look, my position is the same as yours. I'm just saying that if a person has disordered loves, they can just sort of will to fix it. What's the problem, right? And this is where probably I need to just clarify. Pelagius and Celestius were two very different figures. Pelagius does not seem to hold what Celestius holds, right? Celestius was the sort of radical, crazy moralist that sparked the dispute. Pelagius himself was much more moderate, and a lot of people tried to give Pelagius slack and say, well, I think he might actually be a little more like either the early Latin fathers or have a greater affinity for the Eastern fathers or something like that. And so there's a lot of attempts, historically speaking, to try to say that Pelagius wasn't quite the villain that he was made out to be in the Latin West. And it is interesting, like Photius, in terms of the Christian East, actually recommended that catechumens read Pelagius. So all that's to say is, like, Pelagius's position, wasn't as radical as what I described in terms of Celestius. All that Pelagius was really saying is it's within your power to make choices, to repent and to, turn toward God and do things that are pleasing to him. What's the problem, Augustine? You said the same thing, right? And that right there was the thing that really sort of shaped Augustine's theology, because there was a part of Augustine that's really asking, like, what does it mean that we're saved by grace, right? Because at the end of the day, if salvation is based on merits. And keep in mind, this was, the Latin position that a person ultimately is judged upright before God, because they have produced positive merits and their demerits have been absolved or washed away. And so then the question is, if I find favor with God through merits, and those merits come from me doing just deeds from properly ordered loves, and those just deeds are done within my own power, in what sense has God saved me? In what sense is this righteousness from God? Because the justice actually seems to be from me and from my own will. And that's what gets Augustine's wheels turning in terms of trying to figure out, like, how do I fit these two things together, right? This salvation that is by grace, and yet at the same time, our will is involved in it. And this is where what becomes the sort of normative Latin position about the relationship between free will and grace ends up taking shape within the context of this dispute. And so how Augustine ends up solving this riddle is ultimately what he wants to say is that, okay, it's true that deeds done from disordered loves produce demerits, and it's true that deeds, righteous deeds, deeds done from properly ordered loves produce merits. But the thing is, I'm going to retract my position that says it's within the natural capacity of man to reorder his loves. That becomes the critical move. So what's the alternative? Well, the alternative is that what Augustine wants to say is that man has no natural capacity to have properly ordered loves. That properly ordered set of loves has to be a gift from God. And so this is where grace comes into play. So what is grace? In this context, grace is a created effect. It is that God wills to give to you or to fix or correct your order of loves. And so now when grace enters the picture, all of a sudden my disordered loves become properly ordered. Now, what's the importance of this? Well, the importance of this is that now I am in a state of grace. And from within this state of grace, I actually have the capacity now to make choices that are pleasing to God. So the balancing act between free will and grace that begins to emerge here is the balancing act that says, yes, I had to freely cooperate with God, right? I had to use this grace. From this state of grace, I had to do good deeds that are pleasing to God, feed the poor, right? Almsgiving, whatever it might be. And as I engage in this love of neighbor and love of God, I end up producing merits. However, the only reason I'm capable of doing just and pleasing deeds is because of a prior act of God. The fact that God has willed to fix and correct my order of loves by providing what would later be called prevenient grace, right? This prevenient grace that reorders my loves and enables me to do that. So in this sense, yes, God's going to reward me for my good deeds. That's true. But the only reason I'm capable of producing good deeds is because of a prior grace. And that's how Augustine tries to, have his cake and eat it too, I guess, if we like that phrase. I don't really like that phrase, but whatever, right? Like the concept is what he wants to say is that, yes, grace is necessary. I couldn't do it without God. And therefore, the grace coming in is the reason I can do this. And yet I have to freely cooperate. And so it is a cooperation on my part with grace. And in this sense, God is rewarding what he's put into me in the first place. That's actually what Augustine says, that God is only rewarding what he put into you in the first place. Now, the question, of course, is like, well, can I cast off grace? And Augustine would say, yes, that I can go ahead and I can say, you know what, even though I am in a position of grace, I'm going to choose to freely sin and cast off grace. And in choosing to sin, now I am in a place where my loves are back to their original state, which is disordered, and I can no longer produce meritorious deeds. Incidentally, if that happens, Augustine wants to say that's all on you, right? That is not because of a deficiency in the grace. He's very clear about this, right? That a person could, in principle, hypothetically, take grace, prevenient grace, cooperate with it in perpetuity, and never sin again. He actually does say that. I think it's on Christian Doctrine where he talks about that sort of thing. And so if a person actually casts it off, it is never due to a deficiency in the grace. It's only due to the free will of the person. So what this means is that if I have sinned, right, and I've cast off grace, and I find myself back in a natural state where I am in need of grace, that is entirely on me. That is not because of anything that God has done, right? God provided the grace necessary for me to not do that, and I just chose to cast it off anyway, just like Adam and Eve, right? So this is my own personal fall. And now what happens is Augustine wants to say that there's nothing I can do from this condition in order to, sort of compel God to give me grace. In fact, what he wants to say, and he says this in on the gift of perseverance, for example, he wants to say that what happens is now God is in a position, it's entirely in God's court, to either show me love, right, and mercy, or to show me justice, right? So mercy or justice, and that's entirely up to God, right? Does God want to let me reap what I've sowed, which would be justice, right? I had the grace necessary in order to keep going, and the only reason I fell is because of me, right? So that's all on me. That would be justice, to let me reap what I sow. Or God could decide to show mercy and give me more grace. And now from this sort of added state, right, this restored state where more grace has been given to me, now I can again cooperate and produce merits. And basically for Augustine, on the gift of perseverance at least, his two examples of this are Peter and Judas, right? He wants to say that both of them ended up being converted, both of them had grace, both of them sinned in major ways, casting off that grace, and both of them found themselves in a position where justice would have said, reap what you sow. But mercy would say you're restored. And God chose, for whatever reason, and this is where, according to Augustine, we just can't know, right, the reasons God, may restore a person or not. But for whatever reason, God decided to show mercy to Peter and justice to Judas. And we see the result. Judas ends up hanging himself and he's damned, and Peter ends up being restored and making a right use of grace, and we see him move on and ultimately reach the finish line of salvation, as it were. And so this is how Augustine balances these things, right? He wants to suggest that salvation is by grace, because if a person is producing merits, and if a person makes it to the finish line, as it were, within a state of grace, that is actually because they are cooperating with something that preceded their cooperation, right? God has provided with them the necessary prevenient grace, and they are making a right use of what God has put into them. But at the end of the day, all the merits, God is rewarding what he put into them in the first place. Whereas if a person is damnable, they have no one to blame but themselves, because God provided them grace and they cast it off of their own accord, not due to a deficiency of grace, but just due to their own free will. And so just like Adam and Eve, they did that to themselves. They didn't have to do that at all. Okay, so that becomes sort of the basic framework for the relationship between grace and free will. One of the interesting and fateful moments within this discussion is actually the question of Adam and Eve, right? Because one of the things that you might naturally start to think is, well, I wonder if this is just a post-fall reality, right? So clearly, Augustine holds to a doctrine of original sin. And within original sin, either we participated in Adam and Eve's sin, he toys with that notion, or guilt is transferred to us. But one way or another, there is a damnability that we inherit, right? We are a damned mass from the start. And Augustine is very clear on this when he talks, for example, about the damnation of infants. He goes to all too gruesome detail into saying, well, even if an infant is, the parents of this infant who is dying, they're racing to get that infant to the priest to have the infant baptized before he dies, and the infant dies on the way. The infant goes to hell because, well, God could have preserved the life of the infant long enough to be baptized. And that was I mean, that tells you something about Augustine's position on the sort of natural state of man after the fall. We are a damned mass. That's what he calls us. And so we come into the world damnable, according to Augustine, and then in addition to that, we have these disordered loves. And so that's the state of original sin in which we find ourselves, needing grace and needing purification and baptism and so on. Now, the natural question, though, is to say, so is all that's been said about the disordered loves and the need for prevenient grace, is all of this just a post-fall reality? But it wouldn't have been true for Adam and Eve, right? Like, surely Adam and Eve, you couldn't say that they were in this sort of condition, right? They didn't have original sin. And so surely they must have had a natural capacity to do good, right? Well, Augustine's actually going to say no. And so this is where things get a little peculiar. Because according to Augustine, even Adam and Eve required grace in order to produce deeds pleasing to God. Now, you might say, well, that sounds a little peculiar because I thought they weren't fallen, and that sounds like they are fallen or something like that. Now, clearly, Augustine doesn't want to say they are fallen, right? Nothing has entered the frame yet. That would be an act of sin. That would mean that they had cast off grace or they were in some sort of depraved or corrupt position. But instead, what you still have here within Adam and Eve is you actually do have Augustine not wanting to leave in, like no quarter to the Pelagians. Augustine ends up saying that Adam and Eve were created with grace already given. And so Augustine will grant, sure, Adam and Eve, for them, like in his Enchiridion, for example, he says, like, look, yes, it would have been easy for them to obey and do things pleasing to God. It would have been easy. Like this whole temptation and casting off grace and things like that, that was not due to any sort of difficulty on their part. It would have been easy for them to obey. Because they had grace already. And so this is where what Augustine calls that, he calls it original righteousness. That's his term for that sort of pre-fallen form of grace. But nonetheless, the claim is still the same. And this is where you get the definitive nature-grace divide. So if you've ever heard that term, right, the nature-grace divide, as a term used in the Latin West, this is what it refers to, right? The idea is that nature has no capacity to complete itself or be pleasing to God on its own. It has no natural capacity in order to do that. So if you're going to say, like, even Adam and Eve had no natural capacity to do deeds pleasing to God, clearly nature has no innate capacity to please God. And this comes through actually really clear in the late medieval scholastics. So William of Ockham, who I've talked about before, he is sort of the father of nominalism within the Latin West. William of Ockham is somebody who, because he was a nominalist, liked to defy some of the common sense presumptions of the realists. And by common sense, I just mean common to the realists. So realists, the realists, as anybody who's heard me talk about like qualified omnipotence amongst the realists are fine with saying that logical structures are true, not just for us, but of reality generally. And so things like, God can't make a square circle, or God can't make free creatures that are not free, or something like that. Realists were fine to say that sort of thing. And they weren't saying that that is some thing right out there that God lacks the juice to bring about. What they meant is that's nonsense, right? It's an inherent contradiction. We haven't said anything meaningful, and therefore it's no indictment to God to say he can't do that because we haven't actually offered that for him to do. Whereas William of Ockham, being a nominalist, was happy to say, like, of course God can do certain things, even if he hasn't. And one of those things that you see actually is in the context of the nature-grace divide. So Ockham actually does want to say, like, look, he's going to toe the anti-Pelagian line and say, yes, it's true. No person can do deeds pleasing to God on their own strength without grace. But God could have made a world where creatures could do that. That's what Occam wants to say. So it's interesting. Occam is like he's sitting there saying like, yeah, God could make a world where nature, creatures are fully capable in their own strength to be just and pleasing to God. That's just not the world God's made. God's made a world where we do need grace. And that's why Pelagius is wrong. So Pelagius is talking about a possible world, but it's just not our world. That's Occam's position. And that was deemed a bridge too far, right? That was suspected of ceding too much to the Pelagians. And so that tells you something, right? The Augustinian Latin position really is such that says, look, no, nature per se, period, every possible world, in every possible world, nature is incapable of completing itself or performing deeds that would be pleasing to God. And therefore, there is always a need for some sort of supernatural assistance to complete nature, enabling it to do just deeds. And we call that supernatural assistance grace. And so this is the root of, well, really total depravity. I've mentioned this before. The Calvinists always get sort of blamed for total depravity as if it's some diabolical doctrine that's alien to the West and just too harsh for everybody else. But total depravity is just the Augustinian position, and candidly, like the Lutherans hold it too. It's just anti-Pelagian. That's all that total depravity is. And if you look at the doctrine of total depravity, it's not suggesting that you are the worst version of yourself in the sense that that you have to murder and rape and steal or something like that. It's not suggesting that. It actually, instead, all it's suggesting is that because you have disordered affections or loves that you cannot fix, every one of your deeds, even when it aligns with the moral law, is corrupt or sinful. And this actually is. I mean, this is just Augustine's position, because the order of loves doctrine allowed Augustine to say, contra anti-Pelagian, I don't care if you meet somebody who seems to be a really nice person. I don't care if this guy who is not a Christian goes out and feeds the poor and clothes the naked. If he does all this sort of humanitarian good deed, sort of do-gooder type stuff, beneath that it's all sinful and none of it is pleasing to God. And you might look at that and be like, well, why, right? Like, I'm pretty sure he's doing like good things and, maybe he's chaste and faithful to his wife and, shuns advances from other people and, whatever else, right? We can create the list. Augustine would just be able to say, because he differentiates the outer character of the act from the inner character of the act, he would be able to say, well, that guy is doing it from disordered love, so it's not pleasing. It has demerit before God. And so with Augustine, he's the one who introduces this sort of external versus internal character of the act, where the idea being that, yes, externally, two deeds can look the same, right? This deed might be done in my own strength, where I shun an offer of adultery. And then Joseph's deed, is also a shunning of the offer of adultery. But Joseph does it from pure love of God, and I do it from some other motive that is not wrought in grace, and therefore mine has no merits. In fact, demeritorious, whereas righteous Joseph's was done in grace and out of true love for God, and therefore has merit. Augustine's system allows you to go ahead and say externally the acts align with the moral law, but internally they are corrupt and sinful and actually demeritorious. And that sort of two-layer way of looking at acts is what allows Augustine to go ahead and say, I don't care how nice or good or upright a person looks, at the end of the day, if they are not operating according to grace, it is all sin. And this is the doctrine, the necessity of sin, which is an Augustinian doctrine. And that's all that total depravity really is, right? It's the doctrine that everything you do is tainted by sin of necessity. It is all corrupt and sinful and has no merits before God, and you don't have any natural capacity to fix that. And that's Calvin's position. That's Luther's position. And frankly, every Protestant, from what I can tell, rejects Pelagianism, and for that reason holds to the same doctrine. So it's sort of a weird thing that the Calvinists get sort of pegged as having some diabolical anthropology, when in fact that's just normal anthropology for any within the Augustinian tradition, Catholic or Protestant. So that's the first thing that I think is important to recognize when it comes to anthropology within the Latin West, which is this nature-grace divide. The idea that nature itself is inherently incapable of doing anything that is pleasing to God. And that's true not just post-fall, that's true pre-fall. Nature per se is incapable of doing anything pleasing to God. Also, with that, then, that's what sets the stage for a picture of God where really you get what would be called divine volunteerism. What I mean, using that term in this context, is just the idea that grace becomes truly arbitrary. Arbitrary in the sense of arbitrium. It's a sheer act of will. The idea that because the natural state of man is a state that is damnable, right? We are conceived and come into the world as part of a damned mass, and we have no basis on which we can overturn that of our own strength. We can't do anything to prove that we would somehow make a right use of grace. We can't do anything to sort of bid God to offer us grace. All of those things are very clear within the medieval discussion, where they're so concerned about Pelagianism, so concerned with the idea that you might have a natural capacity to be pleasing to God, that all of that's off the table. And that means that the giving of grace has to originate from God, full stop, by nothing but a divine choice. And then obviously also in the case of us sinning, like Peter and Judas, it is truly arbitrary in terms of whether or not, God gives grace to restore the sinner. And if he gives it to one and not to another, that's really just sort of a mystery of his own choosing. Now, admittedly, Augustine does insert the possibility that God being rational, he probably has his reasons, but those reasons are none of your business. I think that comes through quite clearly in the, what's the story where Augustine, I think he's talking with a Manichae, an advocate of Manichaeism. And the question posed to Augustine is like, well, what was God doing before he created the world? And Augustine's answer was preparing hell for those who probe too deeply. So anyway, Augustine is a big advocate of like, God has his reasons, who are we to say, right? And we just sort of accept that. But that's what creates a certain arbitrariness, right, to God's giving or withholding of grace. Now, this is something that is oftentimes resisted within the Latin West. Within the medieval discussion, you can go see part 2 of my series on a brief history of predestination, where I talk about the different sort of positions that start to emerge. And you can contrast like Peter Auriel with like Gregory Rimini, for example. But what you start to see in those is that there are certain people who are comfortable with like, no, God just chooses arbitrarily who's going to be saved and who's going to be damned, who's going to get grace, who's not. And then there are other people who are like, I think that's an indictment of his goodness. I think that's an indictment of he desires all people to be saved. And so they try to come up with models like Peter Auriel, where God gives grace to all and so on. And this is obviously then continues on in the Protestant discussion, where you have like the more Reformed types or Calvinists, and then you have the Remonstrants, who were originally Reformed, but they end up being labeled Arminians after Jacob Arminius, because they're taking a position where they want to say like foreknowledge does play a factor in who God is choosing. And they do want to say he desires all to be saved and so on. And so these sorts of tensions continue to resurface because on the one hand, what you have is you have the nature-grace divide and original sin and the anti-Pelagianism push Western Latin theology in a certain direction where grace becomes arbitrary. And yet at the same time, you have this other push that says like, don't we have to say something about like God desires all people to be saved? And like, don't we really have some sort of choice in this? Like Christians have always rejected fate. So how does this fit in there? And so that tension does tend to emerge within the Latin West. But nonetheless, the reason is because the red line that is created there is a red line where you cannot be a Pelagian and you cannot cede any room to the Pelagians. And this is what forms that nature-grace divide within the Latin West. So that's one aspect that I think really starts to inform how the Latin West sees humanity, right? The fact that we are bound as products of nature, we are of metaphysical necessity, I suppose you could say, incapable of completing ourselves, incapable of doing something that is pleasing to God. That's true before the fall, it's true after. And for that reason, there is a necessity of sin whenever we are in a position where we don't have grace. And that becomes part and parcel of just the nature of man per se. And then that's also why grace is merely an act of, basically divine mercy that comes our way as God decides to offer to us the thing that we need in order to achieve that proper end. But really, it is in his domain to choose whether or not to give it to us. He has no obligation to do it because we can't do anything meritorious in order to, impel him, right, or compel him. We can't do anything of our own accord that would say, I'm owed that, right? And so in this sense, it has to be arbitrary. So that's one aspect of what you see come through within the Latin West. I think another aspect of anthropology that merits attention when talking about East-West differences is actually basically the body-soul relationship and some of the things that are present there. Now, ironically, the position I'm going to take with regard to this particular topic is that the divide is not what it is sometimes made out to be. So oftentimes you'll find if you actually dig into contemporary philosophy of religion discussions, people who are advocates of the Thomist position, which is an extension of the Aristotelian position, tend to think that this is a really important thing in terms of having a holistic perspective of the human person, and they set it in opposition to dualism. So what does that long string of words mean? So within Thomism, there is an advocacy of what is called hylomorphism. And hylomorphism, for people who have ever, listened to me talk about realism and metaphysical realism, things like that, is basically a position that emerges in Aristotle, where the idea is that every object that you might encounter, you, me, cats, dogs, everything around you, is composed of two things, which is form and matter. And so matter within the Aristotelian context is nothing but this sort of substratum, which is the potential to be something, right? And I oftentimes tend to illustrate this by grabbing fabric and showing that it's potentially, spherical, and then I wrap it around a ball, or potentially cubical and you wrap it around a cube, right? And that potential becomes concretely real. And so Aristotle believes that when you're encountering an object like you and me, what you see concrete formal properties, right? I am a human being. I have 10 fingers, 10 toes, right? I'm a certain color. I'm in this position, situation. All of these are concrete properties, right? Properties, abstract properties, right? Like you can abstract or think about the nature of man as this rational animal. You can think about, 10-fingered and things like that in the abstract, but here you see it concretely, right? And so those possible abstract properties are concretely manifest in me. And yet, I am subject to change, right? Like those properties, if you watched my gestation, not that any of you did, but you watched me gestate from like this seedling state into a fully grown man, you would see those properties manifest. And the question is, manifest in what? And the answer for Aristotle is matter. So that underlying substratum in which properties manifest, that is called matter. And then the properties themselves are called form, right? And so every object you encounter is form and matter. It is filled with potentiality because it is composed of matter. So it's potentially any number of things. And yet it also is concretely something. So it has formal properties. That's the form matter relationship. Now, that in that way of thinking, which actually was quite common, I've made the case that actually the Eastern Fathers believe in hylomorphism too. There is an additional doctrine related to the soul that Aristotle talks about. So within certain figures like Plato, for example, they thought the body and the soul were two distinct substances, right? Your body is one substance, and then inside of it, for example, moving it, animating it, holding it together, is the second substance called the soul. And that's called body-soul dualism. So that's the dualism I was referring to. Now, Aristotle rejects that view. What Aristotle holds instead, he does believe in the soul, but he thinks the soul is the form of the thing, right? So in the case of me, right, we said that I am matter that has a series of concrete properties, right? I have formal properties, so I am a form matter composite. And what he believes the soul is the form of the body. In other words, what is it that drove matter from that seedling state into this shape right here? And Aristotle's answer is the soul. Now, the reason that's important to a lot of people when they think about this is they say, well, that's a form of monism, meaning for Aristotle, you can't actually separate soul and body. Why? Well, because matter is just bare potential. You rip out the formal properties, you have nothing left, right? You just have the potential to be a thing. And yet at the same time, Aristotle doesn't think you can ever have just form all on its own, right? You never see humanity just floating about in the air, as it were, as a pure abstraction. You only encounter concrete humans. All right, so according to Aristotle, form and matter are mutually dependent. Matter cannot exist on its own without form because it's just bare potential. It wouldn't be anything if it didn't have formal properties. And yet at the same time, formal properties can't just float about in the air. They need to be concretely manifest in something, and that's matter. And so that's why he sees them as mutually dependent. They're distinct from each other, but they are mutually dependent on each other. Now, that ends up being the view that is sometimes called monism. It's a form of monism in this context, body-soul context. And that, monistic view is the view advocated by Thomas Aquinas. And so a lot of times in contemporary discussions, people are like, we have to overcome this modernist notion inherited from Descartes, where the human person is just a mind. And we need a more holistic view of the human person where what they are is not just a mind, right? They are a mind and a body, right? We need a theology of the body, right? And you get that sort of rubbish. And so like that comes through, and then what happens is it becomes very faddish to be like, yes, let's be monistic, Thomists here and things like that. The reason I'm coming down hard on this is because I think that whole sort of fad is rubbish. And here's why. I think it's rubbish because, first of all, if you want a theology of the body, monism versus metaphysical dualism is not going to be the basis for doing it. And here's why. Aristotle's monism, what really differentiated it from dualism was that you couldn't separate the soul from the body. Now, you might ask, does Thomas Aquinas think you can separate the soul from the body? Well, if he's a Christian, he better think that, because obviously there's such a thing as the intermediate state where the soul leaves the body and it continues to exist. And so Thomas Aquinas actually does, of course, say that. He just says, well, it's a miracle, right? It shouldn't be able to happen. Like that's a violation of physics. But, God performs a miracle and he allows the soul to somehow continue to exist. Well, at the end of the day, now you're just like, well, what's the real difference at that point between, body-soul dualism, if you're going to still advocate that they could be separated by miracle, and in fact are separated by miracle, in the intermediate state? That's one thing. So I think the sort of like, oh, we're all going to be Thomists now who have a monistic view, and that's going to be wildly different from metaphysical dualism. I think it's rubbish. It's not wildly different once you introduce the intermediate state where the soul survives. Second of all, if you want a theology of the body, what gives you that is the resurrection from the dead. So the thing is, like, what made body-soul dualism repugnant to the Christians in the ancient world was that Plato thinks you are looking forward to shedding your body, right? Plato thinks you're stuck in this cycle of reincarnation, and part of what you're trying to get to with liberation is actually get to the soul out of that cycle so that it can live without a body. The very fact that for the Christian, you are, as a human being, you are a being who has a body and a soul. You are not a soul trapped in a body, but you are a body and soul, right? The human person has both, right? Body and soul. And your destiny is ultimately to be raised and remain forever, body and soul. That already gives you a theology of the body. So I actually highlight that one in order to say I'm not going to actually advocate that as a significant difference between the Christian East and the Christian West. I will say this. Within the Latin West, you end up getting both views. And that's true continuing on into Protestantism. So there is no singular view within the Latin West in terms of body and soul. But the fact of the matter is, whether you're a body-soul dualist or a monist within the Latin West, you still believe in the intermediate state. So practically, you still think that the soul can separate from the body and then be put back into it. What I do think is relevant when talking about, Western anthropology and its distinctives, relative to the Christian East, is actually faculty psychology. And so I've talked about this in other contexts, again, like a lot of these things, where there's sort of concentric circles overlapping. But medieval faculty psychology basically holds that the mind consists of two faculties, right? The faculty of intellect and the faculty of will. And this becomes an entire discussion within the medieval period. And the idea is, right, that what the intellect is that judging faculty, right? So you and I, when we look out into the world and we face a certain decision, right, like I'm hungry, okay, this occasions a choice. What do I do? Do I fast? Do I eat? Do I delay it, just for a time? What do I do, right? And that is the initial decision. And then, if you start to judge that it is best to eat, then you have to make further judgments. So you're like, okay, I judge that eating is best. So what should I eat? And then I go and I look and I'm like, what's in my fridge, right? And then I start to make decisions about like, do I have the best option here? Do I eat here or do I go out and I get something to eat? Okay, I eat here. That's the best decision. Okay, out of the options that I have, what do I eat? That sort of series of judgments is what it was presumed that the intellect does. It's a judging faculty connecting means and ends, right? And then the will, right, was the acting or choosing faculty. And so, so the idea here being that you and I know what it's like to arrive at a judgment. And then from that judgment, we don't immediately just start to act, right? If we say, you know what? Yeah, I should go work out. That doesn't mean that instantaneously your legs start moving toward the gym. You actually have to will to act on that judgment. And that's why then there was a differentiation between the judging faculty, right, the intellect, and the choosing faculty, which moves you into action. And so that's where you have a difference between intellect and will. And then within this discussion, within the medieval scholastics, you had all sorts of various, disputes over things like, does the will have to follow the final judgment of the intellect? And this is where you get a divide between what's called intellectualists within the Latin West and voluntarists. So intellectualists thought, like Thomas Aquinas, he thought, well, yeah, the will is blind, right? So it just has to, it's just sitting there going like, well, if you say so, intellect, I'll go ahead and do it. And so it's a blind follower of the practical intellect. Whereas then what you have is certain people like Scotus, right, voluntarists, you have them saying like, no, we all know what it's like to arrive at a judgment and being like, I don't know. And you go a different route, or you go back to the drawing board in terms of thinking or something like that. And so voluntarists wanted to say like, no. Just because the intellect has run its course doesn't mean that the will acts, right? It is free, it is spontaneous. And so for that reason, right, it can go any number of directions. It doesn't have to act on the final judgment. It could, right, but it can suspend choice, it can redirect the intellect, send it back to the drawing board, whatever. And so voluntarists wanted to say that there were more capacities of will than just that. But what you see is that way of thinking about what the mind is becomes important to the Latin West in general. First of all, how they think about not just human choice, but how they think about divine choice. But it also becomes critical to how they think about even salvation. So if you've heard the term, right, the beatific vision, this refers to specifically a model of, salvation, basically. According to Thomas Aquinas, right, one of the questions that you face when you're talking about the blessed, right, the saints, clearly they stop sinning at some point. And the question is like, how? How is it that the saints stop sinning? Well, how is it that we can be assured that they've reached some sort of state of stability, with regard to holiness? And Thomas Aquinas' answer is, the beatific vision. And the beatific vision, what that actually means in Thomism, is the idea that the intellect now sees the divine essence. And seeing the divine essence, what it comes to realize is that happiness cannot be attained apart from God. So this is an important qualifier in here, right? I talked about it when I was talking about ethics, and I mentioned that one of the sort of least controversial points within the history of ideas is the idea that you and I desire to be happy, and that's what drives us. Now, what was more disputed is the relationship between happiness and pleasure and things like that. And so we talked about all of that. But Aquinas is in keeping with this, right? You and I are pursuing happiness. Now, the thing is, Aquinas wants to say that man cannot achieve happiness without God as his chief end. Why? Right? That's reflective of the order of love's doctrine, that love of God has to be above all else, and only that way can a person attain beatitude. So for Thomas Aquinas, right now, the fact that we don't see God is what allows us to be fallible, and our fallibility is what allows us to sin. Whereas what Aquinas wants to say is that the beatific vision is that now beholding the divine essence, now the intellect sees quite clearly, undeniably, that happiness cannot be had apart from God, and therefore it stops sinning, right? And that's the condition of the saints. That's what beatitude is, beholding this highest good and no longer diverging from it in any of your deeds. And then, you have contrary theories like, in John Duns Scotus, he thinks the problem is actually a problem of the heart or, the will, the fact that we lack proper love of God. And so he wants to, again, as a voluntarist, focus on the will more so than the intellect. But in either case, the idea is that there is something about either intellect or will that needs to be remedied in order to bring about the result that we no longer turn away from God, but rather continue to prioritize him, not just in a given moment, but all the time, that love of God, that highest good becomes the focal point of our existence so that we can basically achieve a stable state of happiness. And that, I think, is something that, as we'll see when we start to talk about Eastern patristic anthropology, is quite a bit different, actually. So there's only one more thing that I want to just touch on here, and hopefully I don't transgress my insistence that this is going to be one episode by adding this, third point in here. Now, I mentioned when talking about, the history of ethics, moral philosophy, I did mention, of course, that Thomism is a form of natural law, moral philosophy. And in fact, it's probably one of the best known examples of natural law, mainly because it's promulgation through the Roman Catholic Church. And I had mentioned that the Eastern Fathers also are advocates of natural law. It's just that probably not as systematically as the Thomists, and so there would be differences there. Now, my interest here is not actually necessarily in natural law per se, but I do think there's something important just to highlight, which is going to set the stage for a difference that I see in the Eastern Fathers. Within natural law ethics, as I had pointed out, the classical form, there's an insistence that every formal cause entails a final cause, right? So the eye for seeing, the ear for hearing, and so on. And so the fact that the eye is a seeing organ is what tells you it's telos, it's proper telos to see. And that's also what tells you it's good and bad, right? What is good and bad for it? Anything that moves it toward health and proper formation and function is its good, and then anything that violates it or harms it and hinders its ability to see is actually an evil to it. And this forms the sort of ontological basis for talking about the order of nature and what is good and what is evil, what is in keeping with the order of nature and what is violative of it. And I think it's important to recognize that that is the normative sort of Western Latin understanding of ethics. Yes, you have divine command theory emerge with people like William of Ockham and certain, sort of nuanced middle ways with John Duns Scotus. But by and large, the sort of objective, sort of natural law ethic that you find in Thomas Aquinas is the dominant position within the Latin West. And that's true not just in Roman Catholicism. It's actually true in natural law. So if you look at Stephen Grable's book on this related to basically the Reformed tradition and natural law. He makes the same case there in terms of the Protestant scholastics, and I think he's quite right. So all of that is to say that within the Latin West, there is an inclination toward realism, which obviously I'm a big advocate of, and that realism ends up playing a central role in its understanding of teleology and of ethics. Now, I think all of that's good. I just put that out there in order to set the stage for a sort of a unique contrast with the Christian East. It's obviously not going to be related to realism. Christian East is realist. But there is going to be something else that's an interesting nuance that I think gets lost in the Latin West by comparison. So, anyway, I think that sets our stage in terms of Latin West, that we can now go ahead and draw our contrast with what we find within the Christian East, thinking about matters of anthropology. Okay, so when talking about anthropology in the Christian East, I think one of the places where I prefer to begin is actually within the Genesis creation account. And the reason is because I think it captures some important nuance that is rather unique about their perspective. So within the Genesis creation account, what you see is you see this familiar story, right? God creates things in heaven, and he creates things on earth, things that are brought forth from the earth. And then what you see is that God decides to make man. And man is this unique creature that on the one hand is drawn up from the dust of the earth, just as were the beasts or the plants. And yet then he is breathed into from heaven and he becomes a living soul. Right? Now, what is unique here, what the Eastern Fathers see in this story, is they see the contrast between the heavenly and the earthly, between the mortal and the immortal. In other words, what they recognize is that when it comes to what God has created, he has created really two types of things. And this is something that's recognized in pagan philosophy around the same time. But what you see is that there is this contrast within the pagans between the realm of being and the realm of becoming, between the mortal and the immortal, the transient and the changing and the permanent. And within the Hebrew text, you see the same sort of thing. You see the ways in which the heavens are associated with the incorruptible and the immortal, and then you see the earth associated with death, right? Obviously, in the fact that things are sent back to the earth that are taken from the earth. So that's the realm of the mortal. And in the case of man, what you see is a hybrid, something that is taken from the earth, the realm of mortality, and breathed into from heaven, the realm of immortality. And this is where you get the doctrine of what is sometimes called man as a microcosm, sort of thing you can find in Gregory of Nyssa, for example, where he talks about the idea that basically all that God has created is merged in this single being. Now, the natural question that arose for folks familiar with this story who looked at it in this way, initially the Alexandrian Jews like Philo, and then the Eastern Church Fathers, was the question of whether or not man is mortal or immortal. If he is taken from the earth, right, the realm of the mortal, and breathed into from heaven, the realm of the immortal, which one is he, right? And the answer that you find initially in Philo of Alexandria, and then echoed as early as figures like Theophilus of Antioch, and echoes in, Nemesius of Emesa, what you end up seeing is that the answer is neither. He is created potentially mortal and potentially immortal because he's a merger of both, but his will functions like the balance, the fulcrum of a balance scale, choosing whether or not to drag down the higher nature and subordinate it to the lower nature, embracing the life of mortal beasts, or whether or not to raise up the lower nature to participate in God with the higher nature and therefore deify it. Help it to partake of God and attain immortality and incorruption and transcend the life of mortal beasts. That's the choice that Adam and Eve face. And so that becomes the natural sort of understanding of it within the Christian East. And this is where you find the distinction within the Eastern Fathers, as early as just people like Irenaeus and then continuing on into the Cappadocians, the distinction between the image and likeness of God. And so if you read the Genesis account, one of the things you'll notice is that God says, let us make man in our own image and according to our own likeness, and then he makes man in his own image, right? And likeness isn't repeated. And the way that was understood by these Eastern Christians was that the image actually refers to that higher nature, right? That mind, that nous, that has the ability to commune with God, that has the capacities of reason to discern and understand the order of nature, and will to operate in accord with it, or hypothetically violate it. But that higher nature is the image of God. That's a small icon of God himself. Whereas the likeness actually refers to the active imitation, the participation in the divine energies. And here, again, people who have listened to me regularly are familiar with the essence energies distinction. You've probably heard it ad nauseum. But the idea is that within the Eastern Fathers, drawing on St. Paul, who gets it from, the Alexandrian Jews as well as from people like Aristotle, there's a distinction between the essence of God and the energies of God. And the idea is that what an essence is, the nature of a thing, whereas the energies are the operations, the active expression that proceed from that nature. And so one of the things I've used to try to illustrate this in the past that I particularly like is something like, I have before me a musician, we'll call him Bach, and I tell you that Bach is a genius, right? He has fully cultivated the art of music, right? He is a master of music. And you say, well, that's marvelous. I appreciate that. That sounds great, right? But I really don't know in practice what that means, right? I don't have a concept of it. I mean, I know what music is, I know what master is, all that sort of stuff, but I don't really know. In reality, I can't look into Bach's chest and see the floating ethereal powers of music that are within him. So help me out. And how I would help you out is to allow Bach to play or to compose. And what would happen is that outward expression or articulation of his mastery of music would be a tangible way for you to understand what is within him. And so even though you can't peer into the chest of Bach and you can't look and say, I see music perfected, musicality perfected, you would, through his operations or his operative powers, come to understand something of that. And so those are processions or articulations or extensions of that inner power, these tangible expressions of the musicality that is within him. And that is basically a glimpse into what it means to talk about the essence and energies of a thing. That the nature or essence of a thing is somehow within the subject, but how you come to understand the nature of a thing is by the processions or outward expressions, tangible articulations of that nature. So with fire, you come to understand the nature of fire primarily by encountering its powers of heating and lighting, right? And then within this concept, within this distinction that emerges within the history of ideas, within the Alexandrian context, there is an additional development, which is the recognition that there's not just a distinction between essence and energies, but in some cases, the energies are communicable. And so the favorite analogy that I've talked about before is the relationship between metal and fire. So I just said that we come to understand the nature of fire by encountering its heating and lighting properties. Whereas metal or iron can be put into communion with fire and come to glow and burn. And in this sense, what has happened is the operative powers that express the nature of fire have been communicated to the iron. And now the iron has these energies of a foreign nature within it. It carries it within its person, as it were, and it communes with fire. And in this sense, right, it is energized by fire, participating in its nature by the energies that proceed from it. Now, that's all important background for understanding what it means when talking about the likeness of God according to the Eastern Fathers. Because when I say that the likeness is the active imitation of God, they do not have in mind something like, well, God is nice to people, so I'll be nice to people, as if we're just talking about a descriptive state of affairs. Rather, they have in mind something far more ontological. The idea being that the communion between humanity and God is supposed to be more like what we see in the person of Christ. So in the person of Christ, one of the things that we see is we see that his human nature, his humanity, is a conduit for things divine. Christ touches people who are unclean, and then because he touches them, him being clean and incorruptible, because he's God, they end up becoming clean. He touches people who are sick, and he who has the life of God in himself, incorrupt, ends up dispelling that corruption and bringing them back to health. He touches people who are dead, and the life of God, which is in him, transfers from him to them and brings them back to life. They begin to commune with the life of God. And we even see the ways in which, in his own person, that flesh, that humanity is transfigured, right? On the transfiguration, you see it glow, right? You see him glow with uncreated light. And in the resurrected Christ, what we see is that his humanity has come to participate in incorruption and immortality. St. Paul tells us, having been raised from the dead, he cannot die again. In other words, his humanity has undergone a metamorphosis, the sort of metamorphosis that St. Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians 15, which is the nature of resurrection, which is what you see for the first time in the person of Christ. Yes, I know Christ raised people, reanimated people, but that's different than resurrection. If you read what Paul has to say in 1 Corinthians 15, you see that resurrection is primarily a metamorphosis, a putting off of corruption for incorruption. That didn't happen with Lazarus or anybody else. They were reanimated, brought back to life, but they weren't resurrected in the way Paul describes it, and that's why Christ is the first fruits of that. But what you see is when you look at the person of Christ, you start to see what it looks like to see a human commune with or participate in God. You see incorruption and immortality within his person, which is something that Paul says quite clearly, God alone is immortal. You begin to see what it looks like for those things to take up residence within a human person. Now, obviously, those things are uniquely divine and they are not native to our human person. But what you do see is that humanity is capable of communing with those things. And that's exactly what you see happening in the person of Christ. And so this is the understanding of what's being talked about with the likeness of God. Adam and Eve are created as human beings. They're not sinful, they're not corrupt, and they have access to the immortal life of God. And for that reason, they are fully capable of communing with God and moving toward him and partaking of the divine nature and becoming exactly what you see in the person of Christ. That's the end for which they're made. That's their destiny, right? And yet, they choose to reject that for the life of mortal beasts. And so we, too, experience that sort of thing, right? The fall has essentially, according to the Eastern Fathers, inverted that human nature, that the choice was made. You know, the will is the fulcrum in the balance scale, and we could go in either direction, embracing the life of beasts or embracing the immortal life of God and becoming like Christ. And we chose the life of beasts. And so you and I come into the world fallen, corrupted. Now, what is that corruption? That corruption is not something about disordered loves or something like that. That corruption is that our higher nature, which is made to commune with God, has been subordinated and subjected to the lower animal nature. And so we experience what St. Paul describes in Romans 7. So in Romans 7, very famous chapter in his letter to the Romans, Paul talks about the fact that, he sees the good and he wants to do the good, but then, the passions of the animal nature rise up and he ends up doing things that he doesn't want to do. And the things he does want to do, he doesn't do. And he ends up basically enslaved to the lower nature, living the life of a beast. And that is the nature of the human condition post-fall, according to the Eastern Fathers, where essentially, rather than being a man riding a horse, where it should be a well-trained horse and, is subservient to his will, it's an out-of-control beast, and you and I are basically along for the ride, subjugated to the tyranny of the animal passions and incapable of raising up the lower nature because essentially we've given it mastery over us. Now, here's the thing that I think is so different about the anthropology that you see in the Christian East, and this goes to the entire claim that man is an icon of God. According to the Eastern Fathers, you do have, yes, you could call it a nature-grace divide, but I don't think that would be the best way to frame it. The divide is a God-creature divide. And why is it that? Well, the first thing that differentiates this from the Latin West is that for the Christian East, grace is God. Okay. So within the Latin West, officially, grace is created, right? Created grace. That's actually the term in the Latin West. And the reason it's created is because when you're talking about grace, the sort of thing I described in the context of Augustine, and that decree has an effect, right? It fixes the order of loves, putting you in a state of grace where you can now do things pleasing to God. But that grace is merely an effect within the creature. That's why it's called created grace. Whereas in the Christian East, grace refers to the divine energies. And so when I talked about that difference between God's essence and God's energies, and I talked about the fact that incorruption, immortality, life of God, holiness, these are actually all energies that exude or proceed from God. They are not creatures. They are God. They are the things around God that are God, or they're the processions of God, or they're the acts of God that precede creation. All these are different terms that you can find within the Eastern Fathers to describe the energies. And so these are in some ways these extensions of the divine nature, these processions, these energies that exude from God, just like heating and lighting sort of proceed out of the nature of fire. And in this sense, they are divine. They are not creatures, right? They are part of God. And so when the creature ends up communing with these, and let's say the creature attains immortality or incorruption, this is not merely an effect within the creature, where the creature has a natural state that has been somehow affected by a divine decree. Rather, there is something of God that is now in the creature and active within the creature. In other words, immortality is a divine attribute. It is an energy that exudes from God. And the creature who becomes immortal is immortal because divine immortality is now in the creature. If the creature becomes holy, it's not just that God has decreed that they're going to be set apart. It's that divine holiness, this energy, has taken up residence within the creature. It has rubbed off, so to speak. If the creature becomes incorruptible, this is a divine energy that is present and resident within the creature. And so this is what it means to partake of the divine nature and to be deified. When you're looking at the person of Christ, what you're seeing is a deified human being, a human nature that is saturated with the divine energies. And that is what the human being is made to become. Yes, of course, Christ is the Son of God, so he also has the divine nature, and that's how he's able to bring those two things together in order to deify the one. But the end of deification, the sort of thing you see in Christ, is the picture of what humanity is supposed to be. The resurrected Christ is the first time you see humanity as we are created to be. What the end goal for Adam and Eve was is that, right? That's the first time you ever see it upon the face of the earth. Every human being is called to be a saint or holy, which can only happen by participating in God's own holiness. Deification of the kind you see in the resurrected Christ is what the human being is called to be, right? That's the destiny of man. Now, that's the first important difference, right? That grace is not merely an effect and it is not created, it is actually an extension of God. It is God within the creature, right? It is the divine energies resident within the creature partaking of the divine nature. That's the first thing. But the second thing actually concerns the word divide. So notice within the Augustinian, anti-Pelagian context, there actually is a divide between nature and grace, right? Grace sits there as something that God must simply choose to enact, and nature has no access to it, no ability to reach up and grab it, no connection with it. It's simply up to God whether or not to choose to affect the creature in this way. That is not the case within the Christian East. And so within the Christian East, one of the things that you see is there is a natural and inseverable connection between the creature and God that allows us a natural connection to grace. What do I mean? Let me begin with an insight from Plato. So Plato, if you know anything about Platonic philosophy, Plato is all about definitions, right? That's what the forms are. They define things. And so Plato at some point explores the question of, what is an image, right? And he notices here something rather interesting about the nature of images, namely that they are inherently referential. So if I'm defining something like a square, I can do so without reference to something outside of it. I can talk about it being a geometric shape, that's its genus. I can talk about, four sides. I can talk about equal length, things like that. Right angles, all that. And so these are internal properties. I can talk about that sort of thing. But one of the things that's interesting about images is that the definition becomes inherently referential. It is the image of. And then I got to point to something else. And Plato finds that rather peculiar and rather interesting. And he also then notices that there are substantial and non-substantial images. For example, a shadow. It's a non-substantial image because it's simply the negation of light. But there are substantial images, right? Things that are real substances, right? So it's not as if images are always negations or somehow a shadow reality. Images can be actually substantial things. And what you have then is you have a thing that by nature has some sort of connection to that which it is tied, right? There's a connection between the image and its archetype. Now, what's interesting is that this insight into images is actually pervasive in the Old Testament. And especially if you read the Old Testament in Greek, like the church fathers did, and you start to reference the Septuagint, one of the things you'll find, for example, is the prohibition on idols in Deuteronomy 4. It doesn't simply talk about idols. So there are two different words, right? Idolos is like idol, right? You could talk about that. And then there's homoioma, which is like a likeness of something. And what's interesting is when God talks about the prohibition on idols, and he actually explains the prohibition, one of the things that's fascinating about what he says is he doesn't use the word idol. Instead, the word that you find is consistently likeness. And so when talking about the prohibition on idols, it's saying, don't make a likeness of this or a likeness of that, right? And then it offers the explanation. Why? Because when I spoke to you on Mount Horeb, you heard a voice and you saw no likeness, right? In other words, the point is that if you make a likeness of a dog, you'll be worshiping a dog. Why? Because that likeness belongs to that thing, not to me. If you make a likeness of a cow, you'll be worshiping a cow. Why? Because that likeness belongs to it, not to me. Whereas you heard a voice and you did not see a likeness, right? So you can't make my likeness. And that actually is the critical point being named. And so what's interesting is the Old Testament has a very clear understanding of this, right? That symbols are the symbol of, right? That names are the name of, that likenesses are the likeness of. There's a connection, there's a tether between the image and the archetype. And so, to no surprise, the Eastern Fathers also recognize this tether. And you see this image archetype language emerge then within the Eastern Fathers. You can find in Gregory of Nazianzus in certain famous passages that people like, Maximus the Confessor quote and talk about. And so that's pervasive in the Eastern Fathers, the understanding that you are an image of God, God is your archetype. And then with that, what accompanies that insight is the fact that you have a natural connection to God. Why? Because you are an image, which means you by nature are tied to that archetype which you image. Now, the reason this is important is because when looking at things like attributes, it was understood that an image is susceptible to the attributes of that which it images. So if you were to make an image of me, one of the things you would see is that image would participate in certain attributes I have. It would reflect or participate in the sort of properties I have as 2-armed or 10-fingered, or the position that I'm in, maybe the color I am, or whatever it may be. And so the idea was that the image is susceptible to the attributes. Now, the critical thing is, when I talked about the energies, when the Eastern Fathers talk about attributes, they are referring to energies. They're not talking about the essential properties of a form, like the way you might say that, the attributes of a square are four-sided and four right angles or something like that. They mean the energies, the expressions or the articulations of that nature. You can see that in Basil of Caesarea's letter 236, I think it is, where he talks about this sort of thing. It's very clear that the attributes are the energies that exude from and articulate the divine nature. And so, again, the fact that we are an icon of God is the very thing that makes us susceptible to the attributes of God or his energies. And so that's why, once again, there's a connection within the Eastern Fathers between the image and the likeness. The fact that you are an image of God is the thing that makes it possible for you to bear his likeness. That's what makes us susceptible to those attributes. That's what makes it possible for us to freely choose to participate or partake in the divine nature, as Peter puts it, right? Partake of the divine nature, which is how you escape the corruption that has come upon the world. Now, what this means is that there is not a God-creature divide. Rather, the creature, you and I as images of God, have a natural connection with our archetype. You and I have a natural susceptibility to the divine attributes. We have a natural capacity to bear the divine likeness. And in fact, the fall doesn't change this. And so there is no God-creature divide. There's a God-creature difference, yes, but us being images of God have a natural connection with God. Us being images of God means that we have a natural susceptibility or capacity for bearing the likeness of God, and the fall doesn't change that. In fact, you can see this in the fact that people like St. Anthony, right, the great desert father, St. Anthony, in one of his talks spiritual talks, what he says is, if you just untwist the soul, it does what it's naturally supposed to do, which is deify the person. In other words, he's identifying the fact that the soul has that natural capacity to ascend to God. The problem is just that it's twisted. And you see this come through in people like Gregory of Nyssa and how they explain the nature of the fall. So with regard to, say, the parable of the lost coin, how Gregory of Nyssa interprets this parable. You're familiar with the parable, I presume, where Christ gives a series of parables about things that have been lost. And one of them is about this woman who has a coin of great value. She loses it. The house is cluttered. She can't find it. And so what she does is she cleans out the whole house, sweeps out the whole house until she finds it. And then she throws this party and celebrates that whole thing. And the way Gregory of Nyssa interprets this is that the house is humanity. The precious coin is the image of God. The clutter is the passions, and the woman is Christ. And so that's what Gregory of Nyssa sees there. What happens in the fall is not that we cease to bear the image of God. What happens in the fall is not that that image ceases to be a natural bridge between us and divinity, that if it were unearthed and untwisted, that it would deify us. None of that changes in the fall. What happens in the fall is that image is buried under the passions. And because that higher nature is enslaved and subjugated to the lower nature, it's incapable of doing the things that it should do by nature, which is turn to God, partake of the divine nature, and deify the person. And so how Gregory understands the work of Christ is that Christ in the incarnation takes on humanity specifically in order to correct that nature from the inside. He takes on that nature and he purifies it. He makes it clean. He makes it holy. He turns the will back toward God. He clears away the passions and puts them back in right order. And he turns the soul toward God in order to commune with the divine nature. And that's why what you see in the person of Christ is the natural state of man, where man becomes deified by communion with God. That's what you see there. But Gregory's point here, this is the thing that I'm looking to highlight, is that when you're looking at the condition of man, there is no loss of the natural connection between that image and that archetype. What's happening is not the introduction of something new. what's happening is the unearthing of something that is still present, because you can't get rid of the image of God. That is a natural part of us. And in this sense, this is why I said the difference is that there is no divide. Yes, deification, theosis, partaking of the divine nature is something that is supernatural, right? You are participating in a supernature, which is God. But your access to that, your communion with that, is the most natural thing possible. Why? Because man, by nature, is an image of God. That's what you are made to do, is to commune with God. And the thing that makes it possible within you, that image within you, that makes that possible, never goes away, can't be eradicated. It can only ever be subjugated, suppressed, and twisted. It can't be eradicated. And so with the Eastern Fathers, what you see is not a nature-grace divide. You see a God-creature difference, but the God-creature difference in the case of this particular creature, of man, has a natural and unbreakable connection with his divine archetype. It's just that our distorted condition has crippled us such that we have trouble ascending to our archetype and partaking of the divine nature the way we are made to. And that's what the work of Christ and then the hospital of the church is there to help facilitate on our behalf. Now, I think for that reason, you also have a less cynical view of the human person. And this is what I mean. Remember when I talked about the necessity of sin, we're a damn mass, total depravity, that sort of thing. And I explained that that's sort of the natural outgrowth of the Latin anti-Pelagian position. Well, within Eastern Christianity, you don't have that same sort of cynical thing. Yes, you certainly do have, if you read the writings of the saints in the Christian East, they do talk about themselves being, terrible sinners and all that sort of thing. But at the same time, there is a recognition of that icon of God that sits there underneath the clutter that just can't go away. And so that's one of the reasons why you'll find a lot of saints talk with such grand compassion about not judging a person, about, remembering the icon of God that is sort of the true worth of the person. It's also one of the reasons why I think it's in Saint Seraphim of Seraph, where he talks about the fact that, even people, when they do good deeds and things like that, before becoming Christians, and then they join themselves to Christ, those prior good deeds are actually to their credit and so on. It's interesting, right? There's not a cynical view that says, look, good deeds aren't really good deeds, right? There is a recognition that that icon of God is there. And I think for that reason, you also get a very different perspective with regard to grace. Because one of the things that you end up having within the Christian East, that again is different than the Christian West, in the Latin West, you have a tendency to almost differentiate sort of like natural morality from supernatural morality. Like I'd mentioned that Aristotelian virtue ethics are, pretty popular within the Latin medievals. But at the same time, in keeping with the anti-Pelagian impulse, you have to say that even if a person is developing these sorts of habits, if they're doing it apart from grace, right, it wouldn't be in some ways salvific. And so sometimes within the Latin West, you get this sort of strange differentiation between natural ethics or natural morality versus sort of done in accord with grace. Whereas what you have in the Christian East, there really isn't a concept of virtue apart from Christ. Basically, a person is always either participating in God and cooperating with him or cooperating with the devil. And there's not really a neutral space, right? Like once you're talking about spiritual, rational beings who constantly face choices about whether or not to conform to the order of nature or violate it, really we're perpetually either sort of moving in cooperation with God or diverging from cooperation with God. And there's this sense in which you and I live within a spiritual space that is, perpetually imbibing or communing with or partaking of spiritual realities. And so unlike, what you sometimes find, I think, in a lot of sort of modernist, Western frameworks where it's like, well, we're ordinary people living in an ordinary secular world. And then there's some spiritual stuff. And, sometimes we engage in spiritual activities and sometimes we can engage in overtly demonic activities. And I suppose the demons can tempt us and things like that. But there's a lot of neutral space in there that's just kind of secular. You don't really have that within the Christian East. You have the fact that you are perpetually basically either moving into communion with God and thus with all other creatures who are communing with God, or you're retreating from that and communing with something that's very dark, the other creatures that are in rebellion. And so that sort of groundwork, I think, sets the foundation for a very different, way of thinking about grace. So I know that within the Christian West, and especially within how it manifests within the Protestant tradition, there's always this question of whether grace is actually there. And that's because of this sort of arbitrariness about grace that I mentioned before. I know within a Protestant context, for example, there are a lot of people who are like, well, do I really believe, or am I in a state of grace? Now, this emerges for a couple of reasons. I had mentioned within the Augustinian framework that you have sort of the external and internal character of the act, and so just because somebody obeys the law doesn't mean that they're virtuous. And so it's possible for somebody to obey God from disordered loves or obey God from properly ordered loves. The one that's done from grace is meritorious, the other one's not. Now, obviously, within the Protestant framework, there is this, you dispel the notion of, good works being somehow to your salvation, but you still have the notion of grace helping you believe unto salvation. And for that reason, what you end up with, in figures like Calvin, for example, is a similar sort of distinction, but now it's about belief rather than it is, or about faith, rather than it is about good works. So you can talk about a historical faith versus a saving faith. Here, basically, somebody like Calvin acknowledges that maybe you could be convinced by apologetics and reason that there's something true about Christianity, and for that reason you give this sort of mental assent, but you don't have saving faith, right? And this is how somebody like Calvin, who believes that the saints do in fact persevere, according to the providence of God, they do make it to the finish line in a condition of faith. You have to explain, well, what about this guy who seemed to believe and then he wandered away? And the answer is, well, he must have had a historical faith, right? A faith that was a type of mental assent without a change of heart and therefore wasn't saving faith. And then that sort of thing creates this sort of anxiety for a lot of people who are going, well, am I saved, right? I believe, I think I believe. Do I believe? If I believe, is it just a historical faith or is it like saving faith and things like that? And you get a lot of anxiety in a lot of Protestants over, whether or not they really believe, whether or not they're really saved, whether or not they're really the elect and things like that. And then you also have with that, right, this other sort of dichotomy that you have, well, there's good works done, out of, the work of the Holy Spirit in cooperation with God. And then there's other ones that aren't really good works because they're wrought by just human effort and not with the grace of God. And so you end up with this sort of differentiation between, just sort of the outward character of the act done by my own will and this sort of invisible layer that I can't really access because I can't peer behind it and see if grace is actually present. And so that creates this sort of strange dichotomy in the Latin West amongst Protestants and even to an extent amongst Catholics as well, because basically you're sitting there and going, well, like, is grace really active or is it not, right? Are these good deeds done, wrought in prevenient grace, or are they not? Whereas what you see is in the Christian East, because grace is not something that is just sort of arbitrarily handed to a person, right? Where you're sitting there going, I don't know. I mean, I hope I'm doing these things because I have prevenient grace, but maybe I don't. Or I hope I believe because of the Holy Spirit, but maybe I just have a historical faith. Rather than having those sorts of things, within the Eastern Church Fathers, every time I move in cooperation with God, grace is present. Now, granted, this is not to say that there's nothing unique about the graces available in baptism or the graces available in chrismation or the graces available in the Eucharist or something like that. Those are very specific, divine energies and graces offered to a person for their salvation. But the fact of the matter is, when a person begins to look at the world, let's say I'm a Stoic, right? I begin to look at the world and I begin to discern that it is ordered by something like a mind. And I identify it as the Logos. And I see that it has a certain structure. And I begin to try to discern the best way in which I, as a human being, should operate in accord with that structure. I am actually moving in the right direction. And I, as an icon of God, am starting to cooperate with God. As I begin to open myself up to the possibility that there is an incarnation, right? That maybe the Logos actually became flesh and dwelt among us. And I start to explore that, I am actually now cooperating with God. And I think this, incidentally, is this sort of notion that you can cooperate with God without being strictly binary, right? Like I'm on this side of the line or that side of the line with regard to heaven and hell, like you have with a lot of sort of, preaching of the gospel within Protestantism. It addresses a certain anxiety that I think a lot of people have when they hear somebody like myself who is an advocate of orthodoxy, and they're like, well, if orthodoxy is true, what does that mean for Grandma, who was a Baptist? I mean, I think she really loved Jesus. And I, as an Orthodox person, don't feel any need to say that she didn't. I'm guessing Grandma didn't know anything about Orthodoxy. I'm guessing Grandma had somebody talk to her about Jesus at some point. And I'm guessing that she saw something true in that, and she did her best to move in cooperation with that understanding. And I think there's real grace in that. Why? Because when you cooperate with God, you as an icon of God are moving in cooperation with God's energies, with his grace. And, and ultimately Grandma's fate is, well, that's between her and God, right? But the idea being that I don't have to say, just because I think Grandma was, theologically incorrect about this, that, and the other, I don't have to say that there's no cooperation between her and God. Because quite the contrary, every time a person turns toward God and cooperates, they are automatically participating in divine grace. Why? Because they are an icon of God who has a natural tether and connection with divine grace. And that's what synergy is. It is cooperation with God. And so all that's to say is that that's a very different perspective than saying that I have a bunch of natural capacities and no matter what I'm doing, it is all sort of natural and therefore has no merit before God because, I need God to sort of decide arbitrarily to give me grace and fix some order of affection so that these deeds have merit before him. It's a very different concept, right? That does not belong in the Eastern Church Fathers. What you see in the Eastern Church Fathers is exactly what I talked about, which is that you and I are an image of God. For that reason, we have a natural connection with God. For that reason, when we turn to God and we turn away from the passions and we begin to pursue God, we are naturally and automatically cooperating with God. Clearly, a person can cooperate with God by degrees. And the fact that you and I are icons of God that have a natural and unseverable relationship with him means that we can, even before partaking of the medicine of immortality, begin to cooperate with God by turning to him. Synergy begins before you ever enter the doors of the church. Now, those are two major differences between the East and the West. The first being the notion of grace itself, and the second being man's relationship to grace. And then ultimately, on that second point, that's where you get the picture of humanity and the natural connection between man and his archetype that you find amongst the Eastern Fathers. The other two things that I wanted to talk about briefly before wrapping this episode up. The one just had to do with the point that I'd mentioned about, the soul and the mind and things like that. As I said, I don't think there is much to be made of the differences between the Christian East and the Christian West on the view of the soul. I think there are important points to be made there. For example, the Christian East is consistently holds to the body-soul dualist position. John of Damascus, for example, is exceedingly clear that the soul is one substance and the body is a second substance, and this is proved by the intermediate state. So that's that's his understanding of the consensus of the Eastern Fathers, and I agree with his understanding of the consensus of the Eastern Fathers. In addition, with that, because all objects are hylomorphic, basically John is clear, and the Eastern Fathers are clear generally, that the soul too is hylomorphic. It's a form-matter composite. Angels are hylomorphic. They're form-matter composite, and you can see that all throughout the Eastern Fathers. The angels are bodiless powers and immaterial, but you'll find explicit statements where they're relatively immaterial, meaning compared to God, but all creatures are material because we consist of form and matter. And you could see my article. I have a couple of different articles on this, but I guess I'd just point you to my article on whether the soul is a form matter composite. You could look at that one that I published years and years ago, where I talk about that view in the Christian East, and I talk about the varied views in the Latin West in comparison. Now, do I think that that is a significant difference between the Christian East and the Christian West? Yes and no. Here's the no. The no is exactly what I had said. There is no consistent position within the Latin West. Some are monists, some are body-soul dualists. And so it's not as if the Thomist position is like the normative position for the Latin West. You can find people in the Latin West who hold the Eastern patristic view. Bonaventure is a good example of this. But I think where I would add a little bit of a caveat, a little bit of an asterisk, is just the fact that, and this is, again, I'd point you to that same article. Within the Latin West, one of the reasons you have varied views is because they lost in the medieval period the significance of the fact that every creature is hylomorphic. And so, again, I'd point you to that article, and I think that's actually a very telling thing that happened in the Latin West, because if you look at the Arian dispute within the Nicene discussion, right, the discussion within the Arian dispute that sparks the writing of the Nicene Creed and things like that, the idea that what a creature is a hylomorphic composite is actually the confessional position of the Christian church. And so the fact that that falls to the wayside in the Latin West at some point in the medieval period, where some people are like, well, maybe they are, maybe they aren't, but they don't seem to recognize the importance of the position relative to, the Council of Nicaea, I think is telling in terms of a slipping away from, basically the position of the fathers there. So, but do I think it's actually a notable point of difference in anthropology between East and the West? The answer is no. I hope I didn't lose anybody on that aside, but whether I did or not, we are pressing on. The area where I think there's greater significance is what I talked about, actually about faculty psychology. And so this is a critique that I had mentioned in the past, where I was like, well, sometimes what happens is people will today, right, they'll end up critiquing what they call like a Cartesian anthropology. And they identify the Cartesian anthropology. I talked about this in I think I talked about it in probably the first or the second episode. But, Descartes, he ends up defining the person. He talks about, basically a thinking substance, and then he talks about matter as that which extends in space. And so this is where a lot of people think of a Cartesian body-soul dualism, is basically you have the soul, which is a thinking substance, and then the body is an extended substance. And I had mentioned that, like, really, I think, the idea that somehow Descartes is to blame for that, as if he's the first person to think of the self as a thinking substance, is like not really fair. I mean, the fact of the matter is that Plato, and this is exactly what I mentioned, Plato thinks of the soul as the true self, and he thinks of liberation as the soul being liberated from the body, and the soul primarily is something that thinks on the form. So I think Plato has as much of that view of the human person, more so actually than Descartes. The idea that the real person, right, the person themselves, is the thinking substance. And actually, Plato's view is more extreme. At least Descartes' a Christian, right? Like, so Descartes is a Catholic who, believes in the resurrection from the dead. And so he does think of the human person as someone who will retain, the body. Plato thinks of that thinking substance as aimed at disposing of the body, right? So I think the idea that somehow this is like a bridge too far that happens with Descartes is something that, historically speaking, is problematic. But as I said, I actually said, I don't think body-soul dualism versus monism really amounts to much within a Christian context if both believe in the intermediate state and the resurrection from the dead. Both end up saying then that the human person has both body and soul, and both end up saying, right, that even at the death of the body, the soul continues to endure. So I don't actually think that that's the real, sort of point of contention that creates a big divide. Where I think the bigger divide is in faculty psychology. And so I had mentioned here that within the Latin West, there is a tendency to think of the mind as something that primarily is a judging and a choosing faculty. And this ends up playing out in the context of salvation, because when talking about what salvation and the sort of beatitude of the saints really is, you end up in something that involves either the will or the intellect. And in my episode, Misunderstanding Mystery, I talk a little bit about the doctrine of the nous within the Eastern Fathers, and I try to dispel some of the like anti-natural theology tropes about the Christian East, which I think are rubbish. But the point here that I think is really important is that for the Eastern Fathers, the mind or the nous is actually something more than just judging or choosing. So I think there's a misconception that sometimes emerges when people who have an aversion to Latin scholasticism, or at least the doctrines of the Latin scholastics. Scholasticism is just a method. But people who have an aversion to a lot of the doctrines that emerge within the Latin scholastics have a tendency to say nous, the Greek for mind, right? Like nous is not, the intellect, or sometimes they might say nous is not the mind. And that is not correct, right? And what I mean by that is to say that it would be more accurate to say that nous is more than intellect, right? Or more than will. So certainly within the Eastern Fathers, nous actually is the part of you, right? That's the thinking and choosing faculty. Plainly, when Paul is talking in Romans 7 about the conflict between the spirit and the flesh, and the spirit is that higher order, that higher nature that is able to identify the good and does the choosing, he uses the term, spirit interchangeably with nous in Romans 7:27, I think it is. And so that indicates that, nous does do that stuff, right? So nous is indeed a thinking and a choosing faculty. But it is true that within the Eastern Fathers, nous is more than just that. And that really is the part where I think you move into territory where there is a real East-West difference with regard to mind, and ultimately soul, and ultimately with communion with God. So what is this difference? As I explained in that episode, there is a sense in which what you find with the Eastern Fathers, you can find this in, Pseudo-Dionysius, you can find this in Gregory of Nyssa. It's pretty common within the Eastern Fathers, is this idea that there is a certain sort of ascent to God where you think about God, and at some point you sort of pass the realm of intellectual concepts. Now, why would this be? Well, there's good metaphysical reasons for it. So, again, people who have listened to me talk about realism all the time, you've heard me talk about forms. Well, when you're talking about forms, you're talking about finite concepts, right? Even if you are a realist and you're saying the forms are real, you're still talking about things that have definite properties. And definite, definire, is a term that indicates you can draw a line around it. In the Greek, it would be perigroptos, right? These are circumscribable concepts. So when I say line, got it. You've got it in mind. Right angle. Okay. Yep. Got it. You got it in mind. Red. Yep. Okay. Got it. Got it in mind. You can get your mind around those. Those are definite concepts. And those definite concepts, because you can draw a line around them, you can talk about commonalities between things. I'm bipedal, and that other animal species over there is also bipedal, right? So you can talk about commonalities, but you can also talk about differences. I am bipedal, and I draw a line around that concept. And that thing over there is quadrupedal. So I am bipedal, not quadruped. And so you can create difference, right? It's not just similarity, but it's also difference. And that's what those bounded concepts mean. And so when you're talking about the forms, you're talking about that. You're talking about these definite concepts. And the thing is that when the Eastern Fathers talk about the nature of God, one of the things that they will talk about is they will refer to God as like hyperousios, which is basically to say like he's above forms, right? He's a supernature. And what that means is he is above those sorts of finite concepts. He is aperigroptos, if you're going to use the technical term, which the Eastern Fathers do use in reference to God. And so for that reason, your mind cannot grasp God. Why? Well, because your mind thinks in terms of forms. And this is something that I've talked about. I think I talk about this in an article I did a long time ago for religious studies on the begotten not made distinction. So if you want to dig up that article, you can find that. But I talk about the fact that the mind thinks in terms of forms. And there are certain things that are below form, and so the mind can't think about them. And then there are things that are above form, so the mind can't think about them. That's not quite accurate. We can conceptualize them, but we can't grasp them directly. Why? Because the mind grasps forms. We grasp definite properties. And so matter is a good example of something that's sort of like sub-formal. So notice when I describe matter, and I describe it within, this philosophical context, I talk about, how it is pure potential, right? Okay, so it's the potential to be a cat and a dog, and the potential to be a plant and a horse and a human, whatever. And if I were to analogize that, I do something like I've often done in the past. I grab a piece of fabric and I say, look, it's shapeless, but it's potentially in any number of shapes, like spherical. I wrap it around a ball, voila, we've got a sphere. Now, the thing is, that makes sense. Conceptually, you're like, okay, I got it. But you're still not actually conceiving of prime matter. And the reason is this: when I'm using that fabric, that analogy, that fabric still has formal properties, right? It has density. It does have a shape, right? It's got a bunch of properties. Prime matter doesn't have those properties. So if you were to really think of prime matter as pure potential, you'd have to get rid of all properties. And you would say, well, what do I think of? And the answer is you can't think of prime matter as it is, because you think about forms. And since to think on prime matter, you'd have to get rid of forms, you can't get it in mind. Now, that doesn't mean it's not real. Like, you can make the clear metaphysical case for why it must be so, but you're not going to be able to get it in mind, because what your mind gets in mind are forms, and it's not a form. And so in the same way, when you're talking about God and you've ascended past all of these sort of definite properties of things, and you've left that behind to something that is, ontologically maximal, you can't get God in mind either. You've transcended that. And so that's one of the reasons with the Eastern Fathers why they talk about this point where, if you're really talking about God, there's sort of this movement beyond concepts. And now you might say, like, but gosh, like, that feels really lonely. Like, I feel depressed when I think about that. Like, how do I would like to know God and commune with God and things like that. But like, now you're telling me I can't even accurately think about God. Well, I'll say two things. First of all, you think about God in analogies, and that's totally appropriate. And so we analogize things like the Lord is my shepherd, right? And we use anthropomorphic language and all that sort of stuff. And that's totally suitable as a way for us to think about God. But the other thing, and this is the part where we connect with the first point that was made, which I think is really important, which is that the divine energies are actually accessible to us, and in two ways. The one is that according to the Eastern Fathers, they are these finite articulations of the divine nature are accessible. People see it, right? They look and they see the divine glory. There's, there is the theophany over there. And within, the Latin West, the theophanies are not God, right? These are creaturely representatives, or these are, temporary material creations. They're not God. But within the Christian East, they are, right? The theophanies are an appearing of God. Why? Because they're the divine energies. Because God actually can express himself in these finite, accessible articulations. And that's what people see, right? People actually do see theophanies. The voice from heaven, when the Father speaks, that's a divine energy. They hear it, right? The Spirit descending in the form of a dove, that's a divine energy. They see it, right? And people talk this way all the time about seeing God. And incidentally, this is how you balance that weird feature of Scripture where the Hebrew Scriptures are, in the New Testament, are also always talking about, like, well, John will say, no one's ever seen God. And you might go like, what do you mean nobody's ever seen God? People see God all the time in the Bible. What are you talking about, John? And the answer is, nobody sees the divine essence, right? And yet people see something of God. And that's what you see in the story of Moses, where Moses is like, I want to see you, right? And that's, again, kind of weird, because I thought God spoke to Moses face to face as a man speaks with his friend. And God says, no man can see my face and live, but I'll show you my back. And so what you end up with is this odd tension that there is something about God that can't be seen. Nobody's seen it. Nobody can see it and live. And then there's something else about God that can be seen and is accessible. And that's exactly the essence energies distinction as far as the Eastern Fathers are concerned. And so you can find any number of stories of saints who talk about seeing the uncreated light and things like that. And, the Eastern Fathers, when they talk about Adam and Eve, and they talk about Adam and Eve having divine vision, that's what they're talking about, that they had access to see the uncreated energies. But in addition to this, there is also participation, meaning, remember what I said about early on when I talked about Christ and partaking of the divine nature. The likeness of God isn't just imitating God, it is communing with and partaking of the divine nature, something of God that is in you. And this goes to the other aspect of nous that I think is really important. Nous, us being this small image of God, is what makes it possible for us to commune with God. And this is where what you find with the Eastern Fathers is you find a difference between knowing about God and knowing God. And here the knowing God is much more like the Hebrew sense of knowing God, which has to do with intimacy, right? And so the analogy I sometimes like to use to illustrate this difference, this point, is to think of an infant, right? Newly born infant. And that infant drinks deeply from his mother's breast. Now, the question is, does that infant know his mother? And the answer is clearly yes, in a very intimate way that is more intimate than the majority of human people ever will, right? And I say the majority because maybe she has other kids, but more intimate than most people. Even people who have some sort of friendship with her or something like that. But does that infant have a concept of what it means that she is his mother? And the answer is no, right? That infant doesn't have any concept of, I am begotten by my father, I was gestated in her, I was birthed and now drink from her body. There's a relational property of mother to child. Like none of that stuff conceptual, none of that conceptual framework would mean anything to that child. They would be empty noises offered because the child has the potential to attain rationality, but that potential hasn't been manifest into actuality yet. And so that child has no concept of what it means to be a child. And yet the child has intimacy and communion with the mother. Now, I raise that and I use that analogy not in order to say that we should have no concept of God, but just in order to show that communion and intimacy does not require concepts. And so when the Eastern Fathers will critique, for example, the philosophers, who know things about God but don't know God, they are not saying that everything the philosophers said is necessarily false. What they're talking about is that knowing about God is different than knowing God. And what the Christian is called to, what a human being is called to, is intimacy and communion with God that is closer to that of the infant, one who actually partakes of God and communes with God, that type of intimacy that is a participation in the divine nature where God is in you and you are in God. And that sort of thing is that higher mode of knowing. And so when the Eastern Fathers talk about nous, and they talk about nous as the thing that makes that possible, that partaking of God possible. They aren't denying that the mind does things like thinking. They're not denying that the mind forms concepts or is the, locus of us, self-substancing or choosing, free choice. But what they're saying is that the mind is more than that. And for that reason, communing with God, partaking of God, knowing God is not a mere act of intellect, nor is it a mere act of will. It is something deeper that only a being with nous could actually experience. And obviously, we know what it's like to have some sort of intimacy where we go out of ourselves, right? Ecstasy, and commune with another person. That is the thing that a person is supposed to have with God, which is something much more than an intellectual or voluntary act. And that something more is possible because of the divine energies. That is something that we can actually behold as the saints do. And it's also something with which we can commune and in which we can participate, which is the calling of man to bear the likeness of God. So that would be a further difference. Now, the one last thing I wanted to note is something about realism. Now, I had mentioned toward the close of my treatment of the Latin West, I had mentioned that the Latin West is consistently realist, and they were very suspicious of people like William of Ockham, precisely because they thought nominalism lands in heresy. And anybody who has listened to me over the years knows that I am, in fact, yes, I am a realist. And here we go, right? For those of you who don't know what realism is, realism acknowledges the fact that you and I and every other human, we look out into the world and we see structures, things like genera and species and common properties. And the question of realism is, does the mind do that because those things are real? Are we identifying and abstracting structures that are part of the very nature of reality, or are these mental fictions that we impose on the world? If you say they are somehow real, then you are a realist. If you say they're mental fictions, they're just names, then you are a nominalist, from the Latin nomen, for name. So yes, are the Eastern Church Fathers realists? Yes. And so this is actually a point of commonality. But there is another aspect of Eastern patristic realism that is highly unique. And it's not just unique relative to the pagans, it is actually unique relative to the Latin West as well. And it's important to anthropology. And this is the doctrine of the Logoi. So those of you I think most people know the Greek word logos, right? Which, refers to the word. And if you're familiar with the prologue of John, right? In the beginning was the word, right? The logos. And logoi is just the plural of that, right? Words. Now, Logoi, actually, these words of God, on the one hand, this is used in realist context, right? The idea that there are a host of words that speak things into being in the book of Genesis, right? Let there be beasts of the field, right? Something like that. Let there be light, these sorts of things. And these words that are scattered about and, give rise to things are originally within the logos. That is not terribly unique. Augustine of Hippo, again, in his Genesis commentary, you can find that he believes the forms reside within, the logos. And so that's pretty common, right? Second person of the Trinity is the one who actually, bears within him the forms, just like in Neoplatonism. The nous, which was the second hypostasis, divine hypostasis, bore within the mind of God, the nous of God, bore the ideas. So there was nothing, terribly unique about that, either in terms of the Latin West or realism generally. But here's where things do get interesting. So within the Eastern Fathers, one of the things that you find is that they have a very unique understanding of the individual. And this comes out in the development of the doctrine of the Trinity. Because of the doctrines of Trinity and Christology, the Eastern Fathers end up giving greater attention to the question of the individual. And I say greater attention because the pagan philosophers had not given much attention to that question. They were so fixated on the question of the realm of being and these generics, right? Things like genera and species and common properties, that they didn't give much attention to the question of what makes the individual an individual. And so you find very little on that, right? Aristotle defines it somewhat negatively. He's like, well, it's where you run out of predicates, I guess. The Stoics end up suggesting that maybe the individual has an idiosyncratic property. And then in certain people like Plato, you can inferentially sort of arrive at something it has to do with, it's a phenomenon related to matter and instantiation within matter and things like that. But there is not a great deal of attention paid to the details of what makes the individual the individual. But Trinity and Christology forced the Christians, and especially the Eastern Christians, to think through that question. And this is where you get the doctrine of the hypostasis. Now, the term hypostasis exists before them, and as I just actually hinted at, it's used by the Neoplatonists as well. But within the Eastern Christians, it takes on special significance because this is the term that, if you've heard, the Trinity is three persons, one essence. This is the term translated person. Now, that's pulled from the Latin, not from the Greek. But the concept was they were sitting there saying, okay, how do we talk about the person or the subject, right? And this is a term that really they relied heavily, the Cappadocians, who were heavily involved in this discussion, they relied heavily on Origen, because Origen had been in disputes with Sabellians who wanted to say that you just have one God, right? One guy. And then the persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are just masks, that he wears. And so they're just these sort of like personae, right? These personifications, but they're not real, right? They're just personifications of the one guy, right? Certain appearances or manifestations, faces for this one guy. And Origen wanted to say, no, they are substantial. And it's in this context that he's using hypostasis in order to articulate that they're real, right? They are in some ways substantial. And so, within the Cappadocians, they end up clinging to that term because they realize we need language specifically to talk about that. And hypostasis and ousia were synonyms in Greek up to that point. They just meant substances, but substance could mean anything: genera, species, the individual, right? And so the Cappadocians introduced this innovation in language where they're like, look, from now on, and we got the letter where they actually say this, Basil says this. He's like, look, there's a whole bunch of confusion about this. And from now on, ousia just means the common nature, right? Identified by the general noun, like human. And hypostasis means the individual identified by name, Paul, Timothy, Silvanus, right? And they initiate that. And that is a innovation in the Greek language at that point amongst the Christians. And what's interesting is they actually tell us why in Epistle 38, in Basil's Corpus. Perhaps it's Basil, perhaps it's Gregory of Nyssa. There's an authorship dispute, but it doesn't matter. They tell us in Epistle 38, I'll just say Basil. Basil tells us in Epistle 38 why, like what this term means. And what's interesting is he makes a point about substance, right? About realism. And he makes clear that, according to the Eastern Fathers, form, the nature, the essence of a thing is a pure abstraction. It's never concrete. It has no stasis. Okay. So this would be a rejection of extreme realism where the forms just exist someplace. It has no stasis. And therefore, right, in order to have stasis, you need a hypostasis, right? There needs to be something underneath it, that gives it concrete stability. Now, what's interesting here is that clearly the hypostasis is not matter, because the Trinity is not matter. And so what you end up with is this notion that the individual, right, the subject, Dr. Jacobs, you, Sally, you, Nicole, right, you, Julia, you, Tim, you, Bill, you, John. Anyway, we could go on with names. Aaron, we like all of us identified by name are actually substantial realities, right? You are a unique creation, and you have matter and you have form, but you, the subject, are the one beneath that gives that stability. Okay. And this, of course, becomes really pivotal to explaining the Trinity. The Trinity, the individual is not just a material phenomenon because there's no material involved. It's not just a cluster of properties because the divine nature is simple, so there's no cluster of properties. It's not purely negative. Basically, it is the subject that exists beneath the thing that has matter and has form and continues to endure and provides it a singular identity. And that's what the hypostasis is. And that sort of commitments to the reality of the individual was something that, as I said, was initiated because of the Trinity and continued to play a pivotal role in discerning and understanding Christology. But it was very unique relative to the pagan philosophy. And this ends up playing out in a way that is very interesting within the Eastern Fathers. Because the Eastern Fathers, what they start to recognize is that if we're going to say that God has archetypal ideas of what he's going to create, which was the standard Christian position, right? And it was also the Alexandrian Jewish position, right? The idea that when God's saying, let there be this or let there be that, he clearly has an idea of what he's talking about before he initiates it. But if God's creating more than just generics, he's creating individual persons, then he must also have an idea of them. And this is very different from the pagans, right? For the pagans, like with Aristotle, the world just sort of happens in reaction to God. God's perfection, matter just starts to organize itself in response. In Plato, right, God, sort of draws matter, like creates this moving picture of the forms out of matter. But it's not clear that he has any sort of designation of individuals, because after he creates the cosmos, he delegates, the rule of the cosmos to the gods and to rational men and things like that. And, he goes back to contemplating the forms. So he's not, involved in bringing about new individuals or something like that. And so it's not clear within the pagans that God has any concern for the individuals. And this is one of the reasons why the forms typically do not include individuals, because they're just generic definitions. The individual is more of a phenomenon or an accident. Whereas for the Eastern Christians, because God actually is provident, doesn't just make the world, he continues to care for the world. And move the world towards its proper end, and even enters into the world, sends his son to become incarnate within the world, joining the creatures as one of the creatures, and so on. Because of that, the individual actually is one of the things that God makes. And because the individual is an intentional creation, the individual has a certain ideal form. There is an archetype of what I am supposed to be in the mind of God. There's an archetype of what you are supposed to be in the mind of God. God has designs not just generically for the cosmos, but for you and for me. And for that reason, the doctrine of the Logoi goes beyond just sort of the typical realism that says there are generic forms for generic things, right? Dog, cat, tree, whatever. This goes into the idea that you and I have archetypes as well, that God has designs for you and for me. And in fact, this is how the Eastern Fathers understand several things. First of all, this is what they understand predestination to be. John of Damascus says this explicitly, like that, God has an idea in his mind of what I'm supposed to be. And that's what predestination refers to. But also within the Eastern Fathers, predestination is not causal. This is one of the reasons why in Maximus the Confessor, he talks about like the tropos, right? Like the movement that you have in conformity with your archetype or away from it, which determines whether you're moving toward well-being, or corruption. And this is how people like Maximus, as well as St. Anthony, well before him, understand Christ's words to the goats, right? Depart from me, I never knew you, as a way of saying, I don't recognize you. Right? Like whatever you have shaped yourself into, you self-determining being, it is not something I recognize because that's not what I made. Right. And so this is what's actually interesting, that you and I are predestined to become saints, but it is in our hands whether or not to conform to that predestined end or not. And so the reason I bring this up is because one of the things that this introduces is the notion of particular or idiosyncratic teleology. And so within natural law, as I mentioned when talking about like Thomism, for example, there is a tendency to talk about teleology as sort of revelatory for what the good of the thing is, but it usually moves in the realm of just generics, right? The eye for seeing, the ear for hearing, man for being a rational being, and so on and so forth. But what's interesting is within the Eastern Fathers, you have the introduction of idiosyncratic teleology. The idea that you and I are actually different by design as opposed to happenstance. And this really plays out in the fact that the saints, even though they all attain perfection, look different, right? Some are teachers, some are preachers, some are prophets, right? Some tend to the poor, some are healers, whatever it might be. All the saints are different and they are unique, and yet they've all attained perfection. Now, I can see where this could, sort of move into dicey territory. I don't want to cut that off at the pass, which is some people would be like, aha. See, I don't have to conform to the moral law because I'm just unique and different, and God doesn't want me to do that. That actually doesn't follow from the doctrine of the Logoi. The fact of the matter is that you and I are human, and so the general teleology is still there, right? For me to gouge out my eye is still an evil to my eye, even though I have certain idiosyncrasies. Those idiosyncrasies are in harmony with, not violative of, the general order of nature. But it is true that things like my disposition toward being an artist or being a teacher or something like that, that is actually in my DNA, so to speak, right? It is part of the idiosyncratic designs for me as a creature. It makes me different than you. And so in this sense, what you end up finding is you find something within the Eastern Orthodox anthropology that I think is rather peculiar relative to the West. There is a tendency in the Latin West, when reading the stories of the saints, to want to treat those stories like you're a deontologist. So remember what I talked about with deontology in the last episode. Deontology tries to take a particular act and abstract it into a general universal rule, right? And that's pretty common within the Latin West. What's the general abstract rule. That's how we make laws, for example. And so when a Westerner tends to read the stories of the saints, they get a little weirded out because some saints do weird stuff. And so they'll read John Climacus's The Ladder, and they'll read about a dude who was like, I was devoted to like never sitting down ever. Like I wanted to be always attentive to God. And so he builds a vest that he can hook chains to so that even when he sleeps, he's standing up. Okay, that's a real story. Okay. And people are like, do I do I need to do that? Should I like go rig up some chains in my bedroom and build a vest? Is that like that what we're supposed to do? Right? Or they'll read a story about like this abbot who tells some monk like because he thinks he needs to learn humility, go stand out by this, post at this fence, and when people like walk past every day, I want you to ask for their forgiveness. And he stays there for like years asking everybody's forgiveness who walks past, and like, dude, I'm not sure. Is that like, should I be doing that? Or guys who live in a tower for an entire, year on a pole, right? Something like that. And these stories are weird, right? And people look at them like, I don't get it, man. Like, am I supposed to do that? And there is a sense in which the doctrine of the Logoi can account for this. Because what you start to find is you realize like, okay, the common factor there is a love for Christ and a zeal for Christ and a desire to put to death the passions and turn the soul toward God and commune with God. But each one of us is different. Not everybody's called to be a monk. Some people are called to marriage. Not everyone's called to be a teacher or a priest, right? Not everyone is called to be an iconographer. Not everyone is called to be a writer or an artist or a teacher or a preacher or whatever. And if you want the obvious touch point for this, you can point to Paul talking about the body of Christ and different members of the body and things like that. Even though there are generalities about teleology that we all share in common, there is also something idiosyncratic about the fact that God works with you and me, not only where we're at, but also in our own idiosyncratic way, recognizing that we are a unique creation made for unique ends. And if we conform to those ends, we're not all going to look the same. And that's actually by design. So with that, I think I'll wrap up this episode on some of the differences between the Christian East and the Christian West on anthropology. So we'll start in on something new next time, folks. Till then, I'm Nathan Jacobs, and this is the Nathan Jacobs Podcast. Hey, everybody. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. If you haven't subscribed, please do so. Go ahead and hit that bell if there is a bell, and leave a comment. I hear that's great for the algorithm, and also like it and tell your friends. I really appreciate your support. And until next time.